September 1944. Western France. A German general stands in a farmhouse with a map he can barely look at. 20,000 of his men are surrounded. The river is behind them. Patton's tanks are in front of them. And the sky belongs to the Americans. He has three options: fight east and watch his men get shredded by air power before they cross 10 miles, scatter into the countryside, and be hunted down, one by French partisans who remember exactly what 4 years of occupation felt like. Or surrender, and pray that the most feared general in the American army is a man of his word. Here's what almost no history book tells you about George S. Patton. When that German general sent his surrender proposal up the chain of command, with conditions, Patton's own staff pushed back hard. You don't negotiate with a defeated enemy. You don't give prizes to a man who's already lost. Patton overruled them. What happened next didn't just save 20,000 lives. It quietly changed the outcome of the entire French campaign. And it revealed a side of Patton that his legend has almost completely buried. The breakout from Normandy didn't look like a military advance. It looked like a flood. For 2 months, the Allied armies had been penned inside a narrow strip of French coastline, fighting hedgerow to hedgerow, paying for every field in blood. Then, in late July 1944, Patton's Third Army punched through the German line at Avranches, and everything that had been dammed up behind that front came pouring out at once. Armored columns stretched for miles. Trucks ran through the night with their headlights on. Divisions that had spent weeks crawling forward now covered 30, 40, 50 miles in a single day. German commanders radioed headquarters for new defensive lines to hold. By the time the orders came back, the Americans were already past them. There was no front anymore. There was just movement, fast, relentless, in American. In Western France, away from the main thrust of Patton's advance, the war had a different texture. The towns here were quieter. The roads were older. The German forces stationed across this region weren't the armored divisions or the elite infantry that had contested the Normandy beaches. They were the other army, the one that rarely makes it into the histories. Occupation troops who had spent years manning checkpoints and requisitioning grain. Quartermaster battalions keeping supply lines running. Signal units stringing wire between stone buildings. Garrison infantry whose primary job, for most of the war, had been to exist, to be present, to show the flag, to remind the French population who was in charge. They were, in the language of professional soldiers, second-line troops, and second-line troops are not built for what was about to happen to them. General Ernst Volker Hartmann had commanded this mixed force for 14 months. That he was 53 years old, with a soldier's face, economical, watchful, giving nothing away unless he chose to. He had served in the First War as a young lieutenant, survived it, and continued in uniform through the chaos of the Weimar years and into the Wehrmacht. He was not a party man. He had never joined the Nazi movement, never worn the insignia of ideological commitment. He was simply, and this mattered enormously in the weeks to come, a professional soldier. He believed in order, and in the laws that governed armies, in the obligation an officer carried toward the men under his command. He had built his career on those beliefs. In September 1944, they would be the only thing standing between 20,000 men and annihilation. He was studying his maps when the reports began arriving on the morning of August 14th. The first report said American armor had been sighted 40 miles to the east, moving fast. Hartmann read it and noted it. The second report, 2 hours later, placed American units 30 miles to the north. He read that one twice. By evening, a third report came in. A French partisan had told a German patrol that American tanks had been seen on the road south of the Loir River. Hartmann set the paper down on the table and stood very still for a moment. He walked to the window of the farmhouse his headquarters occupied and looked out at the courtyard, where 2 of his staff officers were smoking and talking quietly. And he looked at the elm trees at the edge of the road. He looked at the August sky, pale and cloudless and completely owned by Allied aircraft, which had spent months systematically destroying anything that moved on a French road during daylight hours. Then he went back to the maps. He spent the next 4 hours reconstructing the American positions from fragmentary reports, prisoner interrogations, and the telling silence of units he could no longer reach by radio. What emerged on the paper in front of him was not a front line. It was an encirclement. Patton's armor had moved so fast, so far past the doctrine of how armored advances were supposed to work, that Hartmann's entire force now existed inside a pocket it hadn't even realized was forming. The Loir River ran along their southern edge. The Americans controlled every bridge. To the east, the road to Germany was blocked by units that hadn't been there a week ago. To the north, a partisan activity had turned the countryside into a maze of ambushes and cut wires, and above, always above, the Allied aircraft patrolled in lazy rotations, waiting for anything large enough to be worth a bombing run. Hartmann's force was not small, nearly 20,000 men when you counted all the components spread across the region. The 20,000 men with rifles and supply wagons and field kitchens and all the administrative apparatus of an occupation army that had been designed to administer, not to fight. 20,000 men who, in the span of 72 hours, had gone from an army of occupation to something closer to a besieged city, without walls, without a perimeter, without any real idea of where the enemy was except everywhere. He summoned his senior staff that evening. They gathered around the same table and around the same maps, and he walked them through it without theatrics. The American positions, the river, the roads, the sky. He laid it out the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, not to frighten, but because the truth is the only thing you can actually work with. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. One of his colonels, a man named Brandt, who had been in the army almost as long as Hartmann, said what everyone in the room was already thinking. We're cut off." Hartmann looked at him. "Yes," he said, "we are." He let that sit in the air for a moment. Then he folded the map, slowly and carefully, the way a man does when he intends to use it again. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we decide what to do about it." There is a photograph that Ernst Volker Hartmann kept in the inside pocket of his field jacket for the entirety of the war. Not of his wife, though he had one. Not of his children, though he had two. It was a photograph of 23 young men standing in a muddy courtyard somewhere in Belgium, taken in the autumn of 1917. They are wearing the gray uniforms of the Imperial German Army. They are grinning at the camera with the particular recklessness of men who have survived something and not yet understood that survival is not a permanent condition. Hartmann is in the back row. He is 26 years old, thin as wire, and already wearing the expression that would settle into his face for the rest of his life. Watchful, reserved, giving nothing to the camera that it hadn't earned. Of the 23 men in that photograph, 4 came home. He never spoke about this. He didn't need to. The photograph said everything he refused to say out loud, and he carried it the way other men carry debts, as a reminder of what the world is actually capable of when you let it run without restraint. That he had grown up in the tradition of the Prussian officer corps, which meant he had grown up understanding that soldiering was a profession with its own laws, its own obligations, and its own definitions of honor that existed entirely separately from politics. The army he had joined as a young man had served the Kaiser. The army he continued to serve had survived the Republic and been swallowed by the Third Reich. He had watched all of it, the transitions, the ideological infections. Now, the way the old professional culture had been slowly colonized by party men who wore uniforms but thought in slogans. He had said nothing, because saying something would have accomplished nothing. and because he had learned in Belgium in 1917 that the only thing a man can actually control in a war is the decisions he makes for the people directly under his command. He was not a hero of the resistance. He had filed no protests. He had carried out his orders as an occupation commander with the correct firmness and, where he could manage it, a minimum of cruelty. That was the honest accounting of it, and he made no effort to embellish it. What he was, and this is what mattered in September 1944, was a man who had looked at the photograph in his pocket enough times to have made a decision about himself that no subsequent order could reverse. He would not spend men for nothing. He was constitutionally incapable of it. And the day the arithmetic of a situation stopped making sense, he would find another way, regardless of what the regulations said. The morning after he laid out the encirclement for his staff, Hartmann rose before dawn and walked the perimeter of the farmhouse grounds alone. This was a habit of his, thinking with his feet, giving his mind room to work without the pressure of being observed. He walked slowly, hands behind his back, watching the sky lighten from black to gray to the pale, a washed-out blue that meant another clear day, another day of Allied air dominance, another day in which any large movement of troops on an open road was an invitation to be destroyed from above. He thought about his men, not as a formation, not as 20,000 rifles to be pointed in a direction, but individually, in the aggregate way that a commander who has been in uniform for 29 years thinks about the people beneath him. But there were boys among them who had been conscripted at 17 and were now 19 and had never fired a shot in anger. There were men in their 40s who had been pulled from administrative jobs and handed rifles they barely knew how to use. There were professional soldiers, competent and disciplined, who deserved better than to be fed into a battle that had no tactical logic and no possible outcome except their deaths. The strategic reality was this: his force had no value as a fighting unit. They held no ground that mattered. They guarded no supply line that still existed. The war had moved past them. Literally past them, around them, beyond them, and whatever they did now, it would not change a single thing about the outcome. Patton's army would still race toward Germany. The Reich would still lose. And the only variable that Hartmann's 20,000 men could affect was the number of people, German and American, who would die in the process of resolving their particular, local, irrelevant situation. He stopped walking and stood at the edge of the road, looking east. He was not afraid to die. He had made his peace with that possibility so many times over so many years that it had lost its power to frighten him. What he could not make peace with, what he had never been able to make peace with since the photograph was taken in a Belgian courtyard in 1917, was the idea of dying for nothing, of ordering men to die for nothing, of standing in front of a tribunal of history, however informal, and being unable to explain what exactly the dying had purchased. He could not answer that question if he chose to fight. There was no answer. There was only the order and the obedience and the bodies. He turned and walked back toward the farmhouse. His aide, a 24-year-old lieutenant named Wolf, was waiting at the door with coffee. Hartmann took the cup, drank, handed it back. "Find me a French civilian," he said quietly. "Someone local. Someone the Americans will listen to." Wolf blinked. "Sir, you heard me." Hartmann was already moving past him, back toward the maps. "Someone who can carry a message across the lines without getting shot." He didn't explain further. And he didn't need to. The decision had already been made, out on the road, in the gray morning light, somewhere between the photograph in his pocket and the clear, empty sky above him. The only question left was whether the Americans would honor what he was about to ask them for. He called the meeting for 7 in the morning, which told his senior staff everything they needed to know about his mood. Hartmann didn't hold early meetings to build morale. He held them when the situation had become serious enough that pretending otherwise would be an insult to everyone in the room. There were 6 of them gathered around the table in the farmhouse kitchen. Brandt, who commanded the largest infantry component. a logistics colonel named Felder, who looked like he hadn't slept, 2 battalion commanders whose names Hartmann had to remind himself of because they'd been assigned to him only weeks before the encirclement, his operations officer, that a meticulous man named Streck, and Wolf, his aide, standing near the door with a notepad he hadn't opened. The maps were already spread across the table, weighted at the corners with a coffee cup, an ashtray, a pistol, and a field manual nobody had touched in weeks. Hartmann stood at the head of the table and gave them 10 minutes of pure information. No interpretation, no emotion, just the positions, the distances, the air situation, the state of the roads. He watched their faces as he spoke. The Felder's jaw tightened. Brandt crossed his arms and kept them crossed. The 2 battalion commanders exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second, but said everything. When he finished, he let the silence run for a moment. Then he said, "3 options. I want you to hear all 3 before anyone speaks." The first option was the one that military protocol demanded. Form up, move east, attempt to punch through the American lines, and reach German-held territory. It was, on paper, at what the regulations required of a surrounded force. Maintain offensive spirit, attempt breakout, do not surrender while the capacity to fight remains. Streck had run the numbers the night before because Hartmann had asked him to. He laid them out now, quietly, without drama. The nearest German lines were approximately 90 miles east. Between Hartmann's force and those lines, 2 American armored divisions, multiple infantry regiments, and Allied aircraft flying continuous interdiction patrols over every major road in the region. His force had no armor. They had limited anti-aircraft capability. They would be moving on foot and in trucks through open countryside in broad daylight. Streck's estimate was that they would be destroyed before they covered 10 miles. Nobody argued with the number. The room already knew it. Brandt uncrossed his arms and put his hands flat on the table, staring at the map. And the second option was the one that a certain type of officer, the kind who read too many partisan warfare manuals and not enough casualty reports, might have called resourceful. Disperse. Break the force into small units, send them into the French countryside. Fight as guerrillas. Deny the Americans a clean victory. Make them hunt for every man. Hartmann laid this out in the same flat, informational tone he'd used for the first option. Then he laid out what it meant in practice. His men were not guerrillas. They had no training for it, no supply network for it, no relationship with the terrain. They would be scattered across a region that had spent 4 years under German occupation, 4 years of requisitioned food, enforced labor, reprisal executions, curfews, and the daily grinding humiliation of a population living under foreign control. Every French farmer, every village mayor, every partisan cell operating in the woods would know exactly who these men were and exactly where they were hiding. The partisans had radios. They had local knowledge. They had 4 years of accumulated scores to settle. His men would last weeks, at most. And they would not die cleanly. They would be found in barns and root cellars. They would be turned in by people who had good reasons to turn them in. They would be shot in ditches and left there, in a country that was not their own. For nothing. Felder said very quietly, "That's not a military option. That's a sentence." Hartmann nodded once. Yes. Then he came to the third option. He said the word, surrender, and the room changed in a way that was almost physical. Not panic. These were professional officers. They didn't panic. But something shifted in the air, a kind of collective tightening, as if the word itself carried voltage. He let them feel it. Then he kept talking. The military reality was that surrender was the only option that ended with most of his men alive. The Americans were fighting a conventional war according to conventional rules. They took prisoners, they processed them, they fed them and gave them medical care and moved them to camps. Men who surrendered to American forces went to prisoner of war camps in England, in the United States. They survived the war. They went home. They saw their families again. That was the operational reality. And the legal reality was different. Hitler's standing orders on capitulation were not ambiguous. An officer who surrendered his command without being physically incapable of continued resistance was not a prisoner of war. He was a traitor. The consequences were prescribed: court-martial, and in most cases, execution. This was not theoretical. It had happened. Officers had been hanged for less, and the reach of the Reich extended beyond the officer himself. Families had been detained. Now, wives questioned. Children pulled from schools. The apparatus of Nazi reprisal was not fastidious about limiting itself to the man who had committed the offense. Hartmann laid all of this out. He did not soften it, and he did not dramatize it. He simply put it on the table next to the maps, next to the casualty estimates, next to everything else. Then he stopped talking. The room was quiet for a long moment. Through the farmhouse window, distantly, came the sound of aircraft. American. And almost certainly flying east at altitude, unhurried. Brandt looked up from the map. He looked at Hartmann, and there was something in his expression that was not quite a question, more like a man waiting to see if the ground beneath him was solid. Hartmann did not give him an answer. Not yet. "Think about it," he said. "All of it." And he left them there, in the quiet kitchen, with the maps and the numbers and the sound of engines overhead. And Aldrich Dupont was 51 years old and had taught primary school in the village of Saint-Hilaire-du-Bois for 23 years. He had a schoolteacher's hands, ink-stained, precise, and a schoolteacher's habit of listening to everything said in a room before he spoke himself. He had been detained by Hartmann's forces 6 weeks earlier during a routine sweep for partisan contacts, which he had none of, and had been held in moderate discomfort in a requisitioned barn while Hartmann's intelligence officer determined that he was, in fact, exactly what he appeared to be: a middle-aged man who taught arithmetic and French grammar to children and wanted nothing from the war except for it to end. He had been fed and left largely alone, which made him, by the standards of 1944, one of the luckier men in France. A wolf brought him to Hartmann's office, a small room off the farmhouse kitchen that smelled of old wood and damp maps, on the morning of August 17th. Dupont stood in the doorway with the careful stillness of a man who has learned that stillness is safer than motion when surrounded by armed soldiers. He was thin, wearing a jacket that had been good quality once and wasn't anymore, and with the slightly hollowed look that 4 years of German occupation produced in people who took their food rations at face value. Hartmann gestured to the chair across from his desk and waited until Dupont sat before he spoke. He spoke in French. His French was serviceable rather than elegant, but it was accurate, which was what the situation required. "I am going to ask you to do something," he said. "I will not compel you. If you refuse, you will be released, and you can walk home. Oh, but I want you to hear what I am asking before you answer." Dupont said nothing. He was listening. The message Hartmann had written took up 1 page, in German, with a French translation below it in Wolf's neater hand. It was addressed to the commanding officer of the nearest American formation, identity unknown. It stated, with the economy of a man accustomed to military correspondence, the following: that Hartmann commanded a force of approximately 20,000 German troops currently encircled in the region of the Loir River, that this force had no viable military options and no intention of conducting futile offensive operations, that Hartmann was prepared to surrender the entirety of his command, contingent on 3 conditions. First, that all personnel, officers, and enlisted men alike be treated as prisoners of war under the terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention, fed, housed, given medical attention where required, not subjected to reprisal or punitive treatment. Second, that the surrender be conducted as a formal military capitulation, with appropriate protocol, not as a rout or a collection of fugitives. Third, that no German personnel be transferred to French civil or military authority. This last condition he had underlined. He had written a fourth line at the bottom of the page, below the formal conditions, in his own hand. It said, "These are not requests for special treatment. They are the minimum requirements of military law. If they cannot be guaranteed, my men will fight, because a soldier's death is preferable to what happens to prisoners handed to men with reasons for revenge." I trust the American command understands this arithmetic. He had debated whether to include it. He left it in. DuPont read the message twice. And then he looked up at Hartmann with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not quite surprise, not quite calculation. Something more like a man reassessing a situation he thought he'd already understood. "You're surrendering," he said. "I am attempting to," Hartmann said. "Whether I succeed depends on whether this reaches someone with the authority to respond." DuPont looked at the paper again. "And if the Americans say no?" "Then this conversation didn't happen. And you walk home regardless." Hartmann paused. "And other things happen, which I would prefer to avoid." It was the most he had said out loud about his own preference in any of this. DuPont seemed to understand the weight of it. "My students," DuPont said after a moment. "Some of them are old enough now. They're in the resistance. If this ends without more fighting—" He stopped, set the paper on the desk. "I'll carry your message." He left on foot, with a white cloth tied to a stick that Wolfe had produced from somewhere, walking east on the main road in the direction of the American lines. Hartmann watched from the farmhouse window until DuPont disappeared around the first bend, and then he turned back to the room. That was August 17th, 4 in the afternoon. What followed was the particular torture of waiting that every soldier knows, and nobody ever fully describes. Not the dramatic waiting of a man braced for an attack, but the slow and grinding waiting of a man who has done the one thing he can do and now has to survive the hours until he finds out whether it was enough. Hartmann worked. He reviewed supply reports that no longer mattered. He signed forms that had lost their meaning. He drank the coffee Wolfe brought him without tasting it. At some point, very late, Wolfe set a blanket on the chair across from the desk and went to sleep on it without being asked. Hartmann noticed this and said nothing. And the boy had good instincts. He did not sleep himself. He sat at the desk in the dark farmhouse with his maps and his cold coffee and the photograph in his jacket pocket. And he waited for a war to decide whether it was going to give him back his men. Outside, the French countryside was completely silent. Even the aircraft had stopped. It was the quietest night he could remember in years, and he didn't trust it at all. And the message arrived at 3rd Army headquarters on the evening of August 19th, having passed through 2 American infantry outposts, a regimental intelligence officer, a divisional G2, and a corps staff before anyone with sufficient rank decided it warranted forwarding up the chain. By the time it reached the right desk, it had been translated 3 times and summarized twice. And the summary was already slightly less precise than the original, which was the inevitable fate of anything that traveled through military bureaucracy at speed. Patton was not at headquarters when it arrived. He was forward, the way he almost always was, which was either an inspiration or an inconvenience, depending on which officer you asked. His chief of staff, Brigadier General Hap Gay, read the message first. I had it retranslated from the original German by a staff officer who actually spoke the language, and then convened an informal meeting of the relevant section heads to discuss it before Patton returned. That meeting was already contentious by the time Patton walked through the door. There were 4 officers in the room, and they had sorted themselves without quite meaning to into 2 positions. On one side of the argument, a colonel named Purcell from the G3 operations section, a capable officer with strong opinions and a face that registered disapproval the way a barometer registers pressure, visibly and in advance of the actual event. Purcell had been making the case, for the better part of 20 minutes, that accepting conditional terms from a surrounded enemy was a conceptual error that would metastasize if permitted. His argument was not unreasonable on its face. Unconditional surrender was Allied policy, established at Casablanca in 1943 and repeated at every major command level since. It existed for good reasons, to prevent negotiated arrangements that allowed the German military to preserve itself institutionally, to deny the Reich any propaganda value from favorable terms, to ensure that the war ended completely rather than partially. If Hartmann's conditions were accepted, what did that say to the next German commander who found himself surrounded and decided to draft his own list of requirements? The officer standing across from Purcell, a G2 intelligence lieutenant colonel named Marsh, had been pointing out with increasing exasperation that Hartmann's conditions were not political demands. They were restatements of existing law. The Geneva Convention already required everything Hartmann was asking for. He wasn't negotiating exceptions to American policy. Then he was asking for confirmation that American forces would follow the rules they were already obligated to follow. "He's asking us to promise we won't commit war crimes," Marsh said, for what Gay suspected was the third time. "That's not a concession. That's a baseline." "It sets a precedent," Purcell said. "The Geneva Convention sets the precedent. We signed it." They were still going when Patton came in, read the room in approximately 4 seconds, and held out his hand for the message. Then he read it standing up, which was how he read most things. His face, which was not a face that concealed much, went through something that the officers watching him found difficult to interpret. Not the sharp-edged impatience that meant he thought someone was wasting his time, but something more considered. He read the final paragraph twice, the one Hartmann had written in his own hand. Then he looked up. "How far out are they?" he asked Marsh. Marsh gave him the position and the estimated strength. 20,000, perhaps slightly more, mixed garrison force, limited combat capability, no armor, no air support. Patton nodded slowly. Then he looked at Purcell. "If they decide to fight, not all of them, just the ones with infantry training. What does it cost us to clear them out?" Purcell started to answer in terms of time and logistics. Patton stopped him. "Not time. Men, American soldiers. And how many of them die?" The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when a question has located the exact place where an argument stops being theoretical. Purcell said a number. He said it carefully because he was an honest officer, and the number was not small. Patton set the message on the table. "Then we accept the terms," he said, "because the terms are already the law, and there's no military logic in spending American lives to deny a surrounded enemy the rights he's entitled to anyway." He dictated his written order in less than 5 minutes, to Wolfe's counterpart on the American side, a young captain who wrote shorthand and kept up. The order was characteristically direct. The German force would be received as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. They would be disarmed, processed, fed, given medical attention as required. The officers would be separated from enlisted personnel per standard procedure. No punitive treatment, no handover to French authorities. Formal military protocol would be observed at the surrender itself. He added one line at the end, in the same tone as everything else, which was the tone of a man who did not believe in ambiguity. "Any soldier under my command who mistreats a prisoner will answer to me personally." He signed it and handed it back without looking up. And what he did not say, not in the order, not in the room, was the thing that Marsh understood and Purcell would understand later when the intelligence reports started coming in. Patton was not just resolving the situation at the Loir River, he was broadcasting. Every surrounded German garrison in France existed inside a network of rumor and field communication that the Americans had never fully mapped, and word of how this surrender was handled would travel through that network faster than any official dispatch. If it went correctly, If 20,000 men walked out of that pocket and were treated as the law required, other German commanders would do the arithmetic. They would see that surrender meant survival, that American forces kept their word, that there was a rational alternative to dying in a field for a war that was already decided. If it went badly, or those same commanders would draw the opposite conclusion, and men would fight who might otherwise have laid down their rifles, and American soldiers would die clearing positions that could have been emptied without a shot. Patton had fought his way across 2 continents. He understood, at a level that was almost instinctive by now, that battles are won with armor and artillery and infantry, but wars are ended with something less visible, with the decisions that happen in rooms and in the quiet hours before the shooting starts. He picked up the next document on his desk and got back to work. He woke his officers at 3 in the morning. Not because the logistics required it. The surrender was scheduled for dawn, and dawn was still 2 hours away, but because Hartmann had decided, sometime in the sleepless dark of the previous night, that how his men walked out of this field mattered. Not to the Americans, not to the historical record, to the men themselves, and to what they would carry with them into whatever came next. The camps, the interrogations, the long, uncertain wait for a war to finish dying. They would carry the memory of this morning for the rest of their lives, and he intended to give them something worth carrying. He told his officers, assembled in the farmhouse kitchen in the dark with their coffee and their exhausted faces, exactly what he wanted: full formations, units intact in order, by company where possible, every man shaved, or as close to it as conditions permitted. Uniforms as correct as they could be made. No straggling, no clusters of men moving in loose groups, no appearance of a defeated rabble looking for somewhere to fall down. Brandt started to say something about morale, about whether the men had the capacity for it, after the weeks of encirclement and the grinding psychological weight of waiting. Hartmann stopped him. "They have the capacity," he said. "They need to be asked." He was right. And the officers went out into the dark and asked, and the men, most of them, the vast majority of them, responded with something that looked, in the pre-dawn black, remarkably like relief. They had been waiting for a decision for weeks. Now there was one, and it was real, and it had a shape. There is a particular human comfort in being told, clearly and without equivocation, what to do next, even when what to do next is surrender. By 4:30, the formations were assembling in the fields south of the farmhouse. Hartmann stood outside and listened to it, the sounds of 20,000 men organizing themselves in the dark, the murmur of sergeants calling names, the shuffle of boots on wet grass, the occasional clank of equipment being adjusted. No rifles. The weapons had been stacked the previous evening in the farmyard, under Streck's supervision, and in piles that grew steadily throughout the night until they formed a long, low ridge of steel that caught the moonlight. The men moved without them, and the absence of the weight changed how they stood, looser somehow, and at the same time unburdened in a way that was difficult to articulate but visible if you were watching. Wolf helped Hartmann into his dress uniform at 4:15. It was the uniform he had worn to formal occasions, to inspections, as to the kinds of ceremonies that professional armies conduct in peacetime to remind themselves of what they are. It had been packed in his trunk since the encirclement began, on the theory that there was no occasion that required it. Now there was. Wolf fastened the last button and stepped back. In the lamplight, Hartmann looked at himself briefly in the small mirror above the wash basin, the medals in their correct order, the rank insignia straight, and the face above the collar wearing the expression it always wore, which gave nothing away. He put on his hat and went outside. The sun came up slowly, the way it does in late September, without drama. a gradual lightening of the sky from black to the deep blue of early morning, then to gray, then to the pale gold that meant the day had officially arrived and there was no taking anything back. The American soldiers waiting at the perimeter had been told what to expect. They had not been adequately prepared for the reality of it. The column that emerged from the French countryside was longer than the eye could process. It moved in formation, actual military formation, companies in order, maintaining interval, the way troops move on parade grounds and in training exercises, not the way defeated armies move in fields at dawn. At the front, a single German officer in dress uniform walked alone, slightly ahead of his staff, setting the pace. Captain Roscoe D. That Hale was 28 years old and had been in the army for 3 years and in France for 11 weeks. He had fought through the hedgerows. He had lost men he knew by name. He had developed, like every infantry officer who survives his first month in combat, a comprehensive and specific hatred for the war as a condition of existence, combined with a professional determination to do his job correctly regardless. He stepped forward from the American line and waited. Hartmann stopped 6 feet in front of him. The two men looked at each other across the distance. The German general in his 50s, the American captain in his 20s, both of them dusty and tired and standing in a French field at sunrise with 20,000 lives suspended between them. Hartmann produced the surrender document from inside his jacket. He had carried it there against his chest since the night before. He held it out. Hale took it. He read it. Or made the gesture of reading it, because the reading was formality. The document had already been negotiated, the terms already approved, the decision already made in rooms far from this field. He produced his own copy of the acceptance, signed by officers whose names Hartmann didn't know, and handed it across. Hartmann took it without looking at it. For a moment, neither of them moved. The column behind Hartmann stretched back into the French countryside, beyond the tree line, and beyond the visible horizon, men standing in formation in the early light, waiting, the rifles in the farmyard pile, the sky overhead, pale and completely clear, the aircraft not yet flying. Hale said, in German he had clearly rehearsed, "Your command is accepted as prisoners of war." Hartmann nodded once. It was done. What happened next took hours. The processing, the disarming of the few weapons that hadn't been pre-stacked, the organization into prisoner columns for movement. Much American soldiers moved through the German formations with the particular focused efficiency of men who have been given clear orders and intend to follow them. Food appeared. Field rations, not generous, but real. Medical personnel set up stations. Wounded men who had been carried or supported were taken first. Hartmann stood at the edge of the farmyard and watched his men move through it. He stood there for a long time. Wolf stood beside him, not speaking, which was the correct instinct. At some point, without quite deciding to, Hartmann reached into the inside pocket of his dress jacket. He took out the photograph, the one from Belgium, 1917, 23 young men in a muddy courtyard, and held it in both hands, looking at it in the morning light. Then he put it back. The men were still moving. The line didn't seem to get shorter. There were so many of them, and they were all still alive, and the morning was very quiet. And somewhere to the east, indifferently, yet the war was continuing without them. The first indication that something had changed came in a report that almost didn't get written. A week after the Loir River surrender, a company of American infantry moving through a village in the Loire Valley found a German garrison of roughly 400 men already assembled in the town square, weapons stacked neatly against the fountain, a white sheet hanging from the upper window of the mairie. And the garrison commander, a major in his 40s whose name the report recorded and nobody subsequently remembered, was standing at the front of his men with his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. When the American lieutenant in charge of the patrol approached him, The major said, in careful English he had clearly been rehearsing, that he wished to surrender to American forces, that his men were prepared to comply with all requirements, and that he had heard the Americans followed the rules. The lieutenant, who was 22 years old and had been in France for 8 weeks, processed the surrender with reasonable efficiency and filed a routine report that evening. He noted the phrase, "He had heard the Americans followed the rules," because it struck him as slightly unusual, and unusual things went in reports. Then he moved on, because there was a war happening and unusual things were not in short supply. To the report reached an intelligence officer named Captain Aldous Brierly at Corps headquarters 3 days later. Brierly was the kind of man who noticed patterns before he could articulate them. He had been a statistician at an insurance firm before the war, and the habit of finding signal in noise had followed him into uniform. He put the report in a file and kept reading. Over the following 2 weeks, the file grew. A platoon-sized garrison surrendering on a road in Anjou, again specifically requesting American forces, again citing something they had heard. A supply battalion near Le Mans that laid down its arms to an American armored column and produced improbably a written surrender request that had been drafted days before the column arrived. They had been waiting, it turned out, for Americans specifically. A larger force in a coastal fortification near the Brittany border that sent a formal capitulation request through a Red Cross intermediary rerouted to American headquarters, explicitly refusing to deal with French military authorities. And then, in early September, the report that made Brierly bring the file to his commanding officer, a German regimental commander. A full colonel with a proper combat formation, not a garrison unit, had sent word through an intermediary that he wished to negotiate surrender to American forces. His stated reason, passed through 2 translators, and still clear enough to read. He had heard about the general who surrendered on the Loir River, and he had been told his men would be treated correctly. His message used a specific phrase, treated like soldiers. Brierly's commanding officer read the file without speaking, then read it again. Then he sent it up the chain with a cover note that said, essentially, "This is a pattern. It appears to be deliberate, and it appears to be producing results." The results, when someone sat down and calculated them, were not dramatic in the way that battlefield victories are dramatic. There was no single engagement to point to, no hill taken or city liberated. What there was, instead, was a series of subtractions from the war's cost, positions that would have required assault teams and artillery preparation and American casualties that instead simply opened up and waited. It garrisoned by men who had made a calculation and reached a conclusion that meant they were no longer fighting. Somebody at Third Army headquarters, it was never formally attributed, ran a rough estimate of the manpower that had been removed from the German order of battle through surrender rather than combat since the Loir River action. The number was significant, but not decisive. Nothing individual was decisive in a war this size, but significant in the way that all incremental advantages are significant when they accumulate. Weeks compressed, American lives not spent, ground secured at the cost of paperwork and field rations rather than blood and armor. It didn't look like strategy from the ground. It looked like luck, or like Germans making sensible decisions in impossible situations, which was also true. But the precondition for all of it, the thing that had made the sensible decision feel available rather than theoretical, was a single morning on the Loir River and how it had been handled. Patton saw Brierly's file. He read it the way he read everything, quickly, standing, in less time than the document seemed to warrant. He handed it back without comment. He had known this was coming, not in the specific details, but in the general shape of it. And he understood how armies communicated with themselves in the informal register that existed below official channels. The prisoner who mentioned something to a guard who mentioned it to another prisoner who was transferred to another camp. The French civilian who told a retreating German soldier what he had seen. The letter home that was censored but not quite censored enough. The information moved through those channels like water through soil, slowly, invisibly, in all directions at once. And it arrived where it was going regardless of whether anyone had planned for it. He had planted something in those channels on the morning he approved Hartmann's terms. He had not been certain it would grow, but he had understood that it might, and that the cost of planting it, following the law, treating prisoners correctly, doing what American forces were already obligated to do, was nothing. The cost was zero. And the potential return was exactly what the file now sitting on his desk described. This was not a complicated calculation. It was, in fact, one of the simpler calculations in a war full of genuinely difficult ones. What had made it unusual was not its complexity, but the fact that most commanders never made it at all, because it required thinking about the enemy as a population of people making decisions, rather than an obstacle to be reduced by force. Patton thought about enemies that way. It was one of the things about him that his staff found difficult to categorize, because it didn't fit the portrait, and people are reluctant to complicate portraits they have already framed. He moved the file to the completed stack and picked up the next one. Outside, somewhere east of where he was sitting, the war was still happening. But it was happening with fewer men in it than it would have been. And the difference between those two numbers had walked out of a French field in the early morning light, in formation, hats straight, without firing a shot. That was enough. That was in the accounting that actually mattered. More than enough. There is a version of George Patton that history has decided on, and it is not entirely wrong. The slap is real. The revolvers, ivory-handled, not pearl, he corrected people on this with some irritation, are real. The race across Sicily is the competitive fury directed at Montgomery, the speeches that made men feel simultaneously terrified and invincible, the theatrical self-presentation of a man who understood that armies need to believe in something and had decided they might as well believe in him. All of it real, all of it documented, all of it available in any biography written about him in the 80 years since the war ended. What that version leaves out is the library. Patton read constantly, voraciously, and in the way that men read when they are genuinely trying to understand something, rather than simply accumulate information. He read Caesar's accounts of his Gallic campaigns and annotated them. He read Napoleon's correspondence and drew operational lessons from it. He read the military histories of ancient Carthage and Persia, and the campaigns of Belisarius and the writings of Frederick the Great. Not as a collector of military trivia, but as a working officer trying to extract from 25 centuries of warfare the principles that remained constant regardless of the weapons or the terrain or the political arrangements of the particular era. What he found, returning to it again and again from different directions, was this: that the treatment of defeated enemies was not a humanitarian question. It was a strategic one. Every army in history that had acquired a reputation for butchering prisoners had, in direct consequence, faced enemies who fought longer and harder and at greater cost than the military situation strictly required. Because those enemies understood that surrender offered nothing better than combat. And every army that had maintained the discipline to treat defeated soldiers correctly had, in direct consequence, shortened its wars. That's because rational men in hopeless situations will choose survival over death if survival is a credible option. This was not a complicated observation. It appeared, in various forms, in almost every serious military history Patton had ever read. It was old. Older than the Geneva Convention, older than the Napoleonic Wars, traceable back to the Roman Republic and its careful distinction between enemies who had earned honorable treatment and those who had forfeited it. What was remarkable was not the insight itself, but how few commanders in the field actually applied it, because applying it required overriding the very human impulse toward retribution that combat produces in soldiers and officers alike, and that impulse is powerful and understandable and almost always strategically counterproductive. Patton had no patience for SS units. This is worth being precise about. because the portrait of a man who respected all enemies equally regardless of their conduct is not accurate and would not have been recognizable to him. The ideological enforcers of the Nazi state, the men who ran the camps, who conducted the reprisal executions, who operated outside the laws of war as a matter of policy and conviction, earned nothing from him. He viewed them with a contempt that was not complicated by any professional respect, because they had placed themselves outside the community of professional soldiers by their conduct, and the laws that governed that community did not apply to men who had explicitly rejected those laws. But a Wehrmacht officer, a career soldier who had served in the army before the Nazis, who had followed orders in a war he had not chosen, who had conducted himself within the framework of military law, who, when his situation became hopeless, I made the rational decision to stop fighting and ask for the treatment his men were entitled to. That man was something different. That man was a professional soldier who had done what professional soldiers do. He had assessed the situation, made a decision, and accepted the consequences. Patton respected that. Not sentimentally. He was not a sentimental man, and he would have been annoyed by the suggestion. And he respected it the way one craftsman respects another who has done difficult work correctly under difficult conditions. The respect was professional, bounded, and entirely separate from any sympathy for the cause Hartmann had served. This is the distinction that most accounts of Patton miss, because it is easier to tell the story of a man who is simply aggressive or simply restrained than it is to tell the story of a man who was genuinely both in different registers, for reasons that were internally consistent even when they appeared contradictory from the outside. The Patton who drove his army across France at speeds that exhausted men and broke equipment was not a different man from the Patton who approved a surrendering German general's conditions without negotiation. They were the same man, operating from the same framework. Get the result. Move fast when speed produces results. Show restraint when restraint produces results. I'd destroy the enemy when destruction is necessary. Give the enemy a rational alternative to being destroyed when that alternative is available and costs nothing. The decision on the Loir River cost nothing. That was the part his staff had trouble holding in their minds. The instinct to see restraint as a form of concession, as though declining to punish a defeated man was equivalent to losing something. Patton didn't see it that way. He had read too much history to see it that way. And Hartmann was asking for what the law already required. Giving it to him cost zero. The return on that zero investment was sitting in Brierly's file, accumulating, garrison by garrison, battalion by battalion, in the quiet weeks that followed. There is a line in Caesar. Patton had it nearly memorized, had returned to it enough times that the page in his copy was soft at the edges, about the strategic value of clemency toward defeated enemies who have fought honorably. Caesar wrote it as practical observation, not moral instruction. He was not making an argument about how men ought to be treated. He was making an argument about what works. Patton would have agreed with the framing entirely. He usually did when he read it. He was not a man who needed his military thinking dressed up in the language of virtue. What he needed was for it to be correct. And on the Loire River in August of 1944, 23 centuries after Caesar first committed the observation to writing, it turned out to be exactly that. The camp was in Wiltshire, in the west of England, on land that had been farmland before the war and would be farmland again afterward. It was cold in a way that Western France had not been. A damp, persistent English cold that settled into buildings and didn't leave. The barracks were adequate. The food was regular. There was a library of sorts, assembled from donated books, and with a reasonable selection of German-language titles that had been accumulated over the previous 2 years as the prisoner population grew. Hartmann read extensively. He slept more than he had in years. He walked the perimeter of the compound in the mornings, hands behind his back, the way he had walked the perimeter of every headquarters he had ever occupied. And he thought about things that were not the war, because the war was no longer something he could affect, and he had a practical mind that did not invest itself in things beyond its reach. He did not know in the camp what was happening to his men. They had been dispersed to various facilities in England and the United States, processed into the administrative machinery of prisoner management, their individual fates made invisible by the scale of the operation. And he had requested information about specific officers through the Red Cross. Some requests were answered, most weren't. He learned to read absence as a kind of answer and to file it away without dwelling on it because dwelling served no purpose, and he was 53 years old and had made his peace with the limits of what a man can know. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Hartmann heard about it in the camp common room. From a guard who told them with the manner of a man delivering news, he expected to be received with more emotion than it produced. The men around Hartmann were quiet. A few wept briefly, in the way men weep when something they have been holding very tightly for a very long time is finally allowed to release. Hartmann sat still and said nothing for a long while. He thought about the farmhouse kitchen and the maps, and Brandt's face when he said we're cut off. He thought about DuPont walking east on the road with a white cloth on a stick. He thought about the morning of September 16th, the formations in the gray light, the rifles in the pile, the sky overhead empty and clear. He thought about 20,000 men who were, as far as he knew, alive. Then he went back to the library and read until dinner. The repatriation process took the better part of a year. He returned to Germany in the spring of 1946, to a country that did not resemble, in any meaningful way, the country he had left. The cities he had known were rubble and reconstruction. The political architecture was foreign, zones of occupation, Allied administration, the slow excavation of a national catastrophe. The people he passed on the streets carried the particular expression of populations who have survived something they have not yet decided how to explain to themselves. He found a room in a small town in Bavaria where he had distant relations. And he did not seek attention. He did not give interviews. He wrote no memoir. He had no particular interest in being part of the official narrative of any kind, which was perhaps understandable in a man who had served a regime that history was in the process of categorizing. The summons from the court came in late 1946. It was not unexpected. The legal situation was, by that point, genuinely complicated. The post-war German judicial system was attempting to process the actions of Wehrmacht officers through a framework that was still being assembled, part Allied directive, part revived German law, part improvisation in the face of circumstances for which no legal tradition had prepared anyone. Some officers were being prosecuted for war crimes. Others were being prosecuted under the military laws of the Reich itself, which had technically ceased to exist, but whose statutes were still being applied in certain proceedings, because law is slow, and the alternative to applying some framework was applying none. Capitulation without orders was desertion under the Wehrmacht's military code. The code was clear on this. The fact that the war was over, that the Wehrmacht no longer existed, and that the regime whose code it had been dissolved and its leadership tried at Nuremberg. None of this fully resolved the legal question because law does not dissolve as cleanly as regimes do. Hartmann testified for one day. He brought his maps, the originals, which had been returned to him during repatriation processing, with the bureaucratic thoroughness of an occupying power that kept meticulous records. He brought Streck's casualty estimates, and he brought the position reports from August 1944 that showed, with the cold clarity of military cartography, the exact dimensions of the encirclement. He did not argue. He did not perform contrition or defiance. He laid out the situation as it had existed on August 14, 1944, and asked the court to identify on the maps in front of them which of his available options would have produced a different military outcome. He asked them to consider Streck's numbers, the projected casualties from an attempted breakout, from guerrilla dispersal, and tell him what those deaths would have purchased, strategically, for a Reich that surrendered 9 months later regardless. He was not theatrical about it. He was an old soldier presenting evidence, in the same tone he had used for 30 years to brief officers who needed to make decisions. The court deliberated for 3 weeks. The pardon came without fanfare, and in a document that cited the hopelessness of his military position and the absence of any viable alternative. It was legally precise and emotionally empty, which was appropriate. He had not asked for emotion and did not want it. He lived quietly for the rest of his life. A small apartment, a modest routine, the kinds of days that accumulate without drama in a life that has already had enough of the other kind. He was asked occasionally, by journalists who found him, and by historians in the 1950s and 1960s assembling their accounts of the campaign in France about September 1944. He answered these questions briefly and accurately, without embellishment. There was one thing he said with consistency in every account that recorded him across the years. When asked why the surrender had been possible, what the determining factor had been in the end, he said it the same way each time, without variation. An American general he had never met had decided, at the moment of total victory, that the laws of war still applied, that a defeated enemy was still a soldier, that the minimum requirements of military honor were worth honoring even when there was no practical pressure to do so. Without that decision, made in a room Hartmann had never entered by a man whose voice he had never heard, he believed he would have been compelled to fight. Not because he expected to win, but because military honor, stripped of any viable alternative, demands that you die rather than surrender to men who will treat you as something less than human. Patton had given him an alternative. That was the whole of it. The photograph from Belgium is not in any archive. It was presumably among his effects when he died, in 1971, in the Bavarian apartment, in his sleep at the age of 80. Whether it was buried with him or discarded or simply lost in the way that private things are lost when private men die is not recorded. The 23 young men in a muddy courtyard in 1917. 4 came home. In September 1944, on the Loir River, 20,000 men walked out of a field at dawn and went, eventually, to their own ordinary endings, their own apartments, their own photographs, their own long, ordinary years that they would not have had if 2 commanders had made different decisions in the same season. History does not count the battles that didn't happen. It has no notation for the casualties that were never incurred, no column in any ledger for the mornings that passed quietly because the shooting stopped. It records what occurred and leaves what didn't occur to silence. But the silence is there. If you know where to listen for it, it is very loud.